My own family called me selfish, greedy, and ungrateful. They threw me out of the house after my father died, convinced everyone I only cared about his money, and made sure I walked away with nothing. What they didn't know was that my father had planned for this exact moment. By the time they discovered the truth, it was already too late. My name is Daniel, and for most of my life, I believed family would always stand by each other. I was wrong. Growing up, my older brother, Mark, was always the favorite. Whatever he wanted, he got. A new car? Dad bought it. A failed business? Mom bailed him out. Meanwhile, I worked hard, built my own career, and never asked my parents for anything. When Dad became seriously ill, I was the one driving him to doctor's appointments, picking up his prescriptions, making his meals, and sitting beside him through long nights in the hospital. Mark only showed up when relatives were visiting. He always made sure everyone saw him acting like the perfect son before disappearing again. I never complained. I loved my father, and I wanted to be there for him. Then the day came that changed everything. The morning after Dad's funeral, Mom called everyone to the family house. My brother, my aunt, my cousins, and a few close family friends were already there when I arrived. The room felt cold. No one smiled. No one hugged me. Mark stood up and looked straight at me. "I think it's time you packed your things." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Mom lowered her eyes. "This house belongs to your brother now." I laughed because I honestly thought they were joking. Dad always said everything would be shared equally. Mark reached into a folder and handed me a document. Not anymore. It was a will. According to the paper in my hands, Dad had left Mark the house, the family business, every bank account, every investment, and every valuable possession. My inheritance, $1. I stared at the paper in disbelief. This isn't real. My aunt crossed her arms. "You've always been jealous of your brother." One by one, everyone turned against me. They accused me of only caring about money. They said I was disrespecting my father's final wishes. Even my own mother refused to defend me. Within an hour, I packed one suitcase and walked out of the only home I'd ever known. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every conversation with Dad replayed in my mind. He had always talked about fairness. He believed both his sons deserved equal treatment. None of this made sense. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. "Daniel?" "Yes." "This is Mr. Harrison, your father's attorney." I sat up immediately. "I've been trying to reach your family for weeks. Why didn't you attend the reading of your father's will?" My heart skipped a beat. "What reading?" There was complete silence. Finally, he spoke again. "There was never a reading because no one contacted my office." I drove to his office that same afternoon. Mr. Harrison unlocked a safe and carefully removed a sealed envelope with my father's signature across the flap. He placed it on the desk. "This is your father's original will." My hands trembled as I opened it. Everything Mark had shown us was a lie. The real will divided every asset equally between us. But that wasn't the biggest surprise. Inside the envelope was another letter written in Dad's own handwriting. It said, "Asterisk, Daniel, if you're reading this, then my greatest fear has probably come true. I've watched greed grow inside this family, and I worried someone might try to change my final wishes. That's why I kept the original will here with my attorney. If anyone betrays you after I'm gone, remember this. It says everything about their character and nothing about yours." Asterisk. I couldn't hold back the tears. Even after he was gone, my father had protected me. Mr. Harrison immediately contacted the authorities. The will Mark had presented was sent for forensic examination. Within days, investigators confirmed it had been forged. The signature wasn't my father's. Several pages had been altered. Mark had planned everything long before Dad died. The court case lasted several months. Every lie slowly unraveled. Bank records exposed secret payments. Emails revealed conversations between Mark and the person who helped create the fake documents. Even my mother admitted she knew the will wasn't genuine, but stayed silent because she couldn't bring herself to stand against her favorite son. When the judge finally delivered the decision, justice came swiftly. The fake will was declared invalid. The original will was restored. Mark lost every claim to the inheritance and faced criminal charges for fraud and forgery. As for me, I finally received what my father had intended all along. But the money wasn't what mattered most. The greatest gift was knowing my father had believed in me until the very end. I walked away with my dignity, my peace, and a future no one could steal. Sometimes the deepest betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people who share your last name. But no betrayal lasts forever. Eventually, the truth always finds its way into the light. 3 months passed. Life slowly settled into something that almost felt normal. The business was thriving again. Employees were smiling. Customers had returned, and every morning when I unlocked the front door, I felt like I was honoring my father's memory. The legal battles were finally behind me. For the first time in nearly a year, I wasn't waking up in the middle of the night replaying every painful moment. I thought that chapter of my life had finally ended. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, my assistant knocked softly on my office door. "Daniel," she said cautiously, "there's someone here asking to see you." "Who is it?" She hesitated. "It's your brother." My stomach tightened. For a moment, I considered telling her to send him away. But something made me stand up. When I walked into the lobby, I barely recognized him. The expensive tailored suits were gone. His designer watch was missing. His shoulders were slumped, and his face looked older than I remembered. The confidence he once wore like armor had completely disappeared. He looked like a man who had lost everything. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. Finally, he looked up and quietly said, "I know I don't deserve your time, but I just need 5 minutes." I studied his face. For years, I had imagined what I would say if this moment ever came. Now that it had, I couldn't find the words. I nodded toward my office. 5 minutes. He followed me inside. Neither of us touched the coffee my assistant placed on the table. The silence was almost unbearable. Mark stared at the untouched cup in front of him. Then, without looking at me, he began to speak. "I destroyed everything." Those 4 words hung in the air. "I kept telling myself that I could fix it," he continued. "Every bad decision, every lie. I thought if I just had one more chance, one more deal, everything would work out." He finally looked up, but it never did. He admitted that the forged will wasn't where his deception had started. Years before Dad got sick, he had secretly borrowed against family assets without permission. He invested in risky business ventures, convinced they would make him rich overnight. Instead, they collapsed. To cover those losses, he borrowed even more. He hid bank statements. He lied about debts. He forged signatures on financial documents. Every lie demanded another. Every mistake became bigger than the last. When Dad got sick, he whispered, I panicked. I knew if the inheritance was divided equally, I'd lose everything. My creditors would take my share before I ever saw it. So I convinced myself there was only one way out. The fake will. Hearing him admit it out loud felt different than reading it in court documents. The man sitting across from me wasn't arrogant anymore. He was broken. I told myself I'd make it right someday, he said through tears. But someday never came. The room fell silent again. Rain tapped softly against the office windows. Mark rubbed his hands together nervously before speaking one last time. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I don't deserve another chance. He swallowed hard. But, do you think there will ever be a day when you can see me as your brother again? The question hit harder than I expected. Images flooded my mind. Being thrown out with one suitcase. My mother's silence. The accusations. The sleepless nights. The moment I believed my own father had abandoned me. Pain doesn't disappear simply because justice is served. Some wounds close. Others become scars you carry forever. I looked at the man who had caused so much of that pain. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave and never come back. Another part remembered something my father had always said. Never let someone else's choices determine the kind of man you become. For the first time, I understood what he meant. That evening, after Mark left, I went home and opened the small wooden box that held Dad's letter. I'd read it dozens of times. But somehow, every time I opened it, the words seemed to speak differently. One sentence caught my attention. Asterisk, never let betrayal make you bitter. The world already has enough bitter people. Be the man who chooses peace when anger feels easier. Asterisk. I sat there for a long time, staring at those words. The court had delivered justice. Mark had lost his freedom, his reputation, and nearly everything he'd spent years trying to protect. There was nothing left for me to prove. If I continued carrying hatred, I realized I would only be punishing myself. Dad hadn't spent his life teaching me revenge. He had spent his life teaching me integrity. That was the inheritance no one could ever steal. The next morning, I picked up my phone. I stared at Mark's number for several minutes before finally pressing call. He answered almost immediately. His voice was cautious. Hello. It's me. Silence. I've been thinking about what you asked yesterday. He didn't interrupt. I can't pretend none of this happened. I can't erase what you did, and I can't promise things will ever be the way they were." I heard him quietly exhale. "But I also don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you." The silence on the other end grew heavier. "I hope that one day we can become brothers again, not because we share the same blood, but because we both choose to become better men." I heard him begin to cry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just the quiet sound of someone who finally understood the cost of his own choices. That phone call didn't erase the past. It simply became the first step toward a different future. Several months passed before anything changed again. One afternoon, my phone rang. It was my mother. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Her voice sounded softer than I remembered, older somehow. "Daniel, I was wondering, would you come to dinner this Sunday?" I hesitated. "Who else will be there?" There was a long pause. "Mark." My heart tightened. "I understand if you don't want to come," she whispered. I'd like us to sit together again, even if it's only once." After hanging up, I wrestled with the decision for days. Part of me wanted nothing to do with that house. Another part remembered how much my father had loved seeing us all around one table. On Sunday evening, I drove there. Walking through the front door brought back a flood of memories. The same hallway, the same family photographs, the same dining room where so many happy moments had once lived. But this time, everything felt different. Dinner was painfully quiet. No one seemed to know what to say. My mother kept nervously rearranging the silverware. Mark barely looked up from his plate. Every conversation lasted only a few seconds before fading into silence. Then something unexpected happened. My mother accidentally burned the dinner rolls. The smell filled the kitchen. Without thinking, I laughed. So, I guess some traditions never change. Dad used to joke that Mom could burn water if she tried. For a second, everyone froze. Then Mark chuckled. Mom laughed through her tears. It wasn't a big moment. It didn't erase years of pain, but it reminded us of something we'd forgotten. We weren't just connected by betrayal. We were also connected by love, memories, and the man who had once held us together. Healing didn't happen that night, but hope quietly took its first seat at the table. As I drove home that evening, I realized something. For months, I had believed justice would be the end of my story. It wasn't. Justice had simply opened the door to the rest of my life. The future wasn't about courtrooms, forged wills, or painful memories anymore. It was about deciding who I wanted to become. I could live as the man who had been betrayed, or I could live as the man who survived betrayal without losing himself. When I reached home, I stepped outside before going in. The night sky was clear. For the first time in a very long time, I felt something I hadn't felt since before my father's illness. Peace. I looked up at the stars and quietly smiled. "I hope I made you proud, Dad." The breeze moved gently through the trees, and somehow, in that quiet moment, it felt as though he had heard me. The road ahead was still uncertain. Trust would take time. Relationships would need patience. But I no longer feared the future, because my father had left me something far more valuable than money. He had left me the strength to choose honesty, compassion, and hope, even after the deepest betrayal. And that was an inheritance no one could ever take away. 6 months after the trial ended, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The family business was doing better than it had in years. Customers who had once stayed away returned, not because of advertising or promotions, but because they believed in the honesty behind the company. One afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from a local newspaper. The editor wanted to interview me. At first, I politely declined. I wasn't interested in reliving the worst chapter of my life. The last thing I wanted was my family's pain splashed across the front page for everyone to read. But later that evening, Mr. Harrison called. "Daniel," he said gently, "this isn't about fame. It's about helping someone else." He explained that cases involving forged wills and inheritance fraud were becoming more common than most people realized. Families trusted the wrong people. Important documents disappeared. Greed destroyed relationships that had taken decades to build. "If sharing your story helps even one family protect themselves," he said, "then perhaps your father's experience won't only be remembered for the pain it caused." His words stayed with me. A week later, I sat down with the reporter. For nearly 3 hours, we talked. She asked about my father, about my childhood, about caring for him during his illness, about the day I was thrown out of my own home. She asked whether I hated my brother. I paused before answering. No, I hated what he chose to do. But hatred is too heavy to carry forever. When the interview was published, the headline read, "A son who chose integrity over revenge." Reading those words, I smiled. If my father had seen that headline, I think he would have been proud. Several weeks later, another envelope arrived at my office. There was no return address. Inside was a neatly folded handwritten letter. It began, "Dear Daniel, you'll probably never meet me. But after reading your story in the newspaper, I finally found the courage to question my own father's will. My siblings insisted everything was legitimate. Something didn't feel right. Because of your story, I contacted an attorney. The investigation uncovered forged documents before it was too late. You didn't just save my inheritance. You saved my family from living a lie. Asterisk, thank you. Asterisk. I read the letter twice. Then a third time. For so long, I had wondered why I had gone through so much pain. That letter reminded me that sometimes our hardest battles prepare us to help someone else. Pain had become purpose, and somehow, that made every difficult step feel meaningful. I carefully placed the letter beside my father's handwritten note. Both had become reminders that truth has a way of reaching people when they need it most. On the anniversary of my father's passing, I visited the old family property. Near the edge of the yard stood a massive oak tree. Dad had planted it when I was 8 years old. Back then, it had barely reached my shoulders. Now it towered above the house. Its branches stretched toward the sky. Its roots ran deep beneath the earth. I rested my hand against the rough bark. Dad used to tell me that people were a lot like trees. If your roots are strong, he'd say, storms might bend you, but they won't break you. Standing there, I finally understood what he meant. My family had been shaken. Our lives had changed forever. But the values my father planted inside me had remained. Honesty, compassion, perseverance. Those roots had carried me through every storm. The wind rustled gently through the leaves. For a brief moment, it almost felt as though Dad was standing beside me again. Not in body, but in every lesson he had left behind. Before leaving town, I stopped by my father's grave. The cemetery was peaceful. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees. As I approached the headstone, I noticed something unusual. Fresh flowers. Someone had visited earlier that morning. Beside the bouquet lay a folded piece of paper. I picked it up carefully. 5 simple words were written inside. Asterisk, I'm trying to do better. Asterisk. There was no signature. None was needed. I knew immediately who had written it. Mark. I stood there quietly for several minutes. The note didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the lies. It didn't heal every wound. But it represented something far more important. The first genuine step toward becoming a different man. My father always believed people could change if they were willing to face the truth. Maybe he had been right all along. I gently placed the note beneath the flowers. Then I whispered, I think you'd be proud of him for trying. People often ask me if fighting for my inheritance was worth it. They're usually expecting me to talk about the money, the house, the business, the investments. But those things were never the greatest prize. The real inheritance my father left me couldn't be measured in dollars. He left me his integrity, his kindness, his quiet strength. He taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy. Sometimes it costs you relationships. Sometimes it costs you comfort. Sometimes it costs you everything. But in the end, character is the one possession no one can steal. Today, when I unlock the doors to the family business each morning, I don't think about the courtroom. I don't think about the forged will. I don't think about betrayal. Instead, I think about my father's smile. I think about the countless lessons he taught me without ever realizing how much they would one day matter. And every evening, as I lock those same doors, I leave knowing I've honored the legacy he trusted me to protect. If this story has taught me anything, it's this. The people who betray you may take your peace for a season. They may steal your trust. They may even take away your home. But they can never take your integrity unless you choose to give it away. Truth may be delayed. Justice may require patience. Healing may take years. But when you refuse to let bitterness define you, you discover something extraordinary. The greatest inheritance isn't wealth. It isn't property. It isn't status. The greatest inheritance is becoming the kind of person whose life reflects honesty, courage, and love. And that is a legacy that lasts forever.